right? Okay. How much should player be able to change the past? Historical games, what are they? What makes a game historical? Who plays them and why? What are the benefits and challenges in designing and producing a historical game? This particular talk will focus on the high-level design of things, creative direction, a bit of marketing. So it would be useful for, I would say, indie developers, aspiring game designers, professional designers who would like to venture into historical games eventually. I know a lot of you guys are working in Ubisoft, of course, Assassin's Creed. So I hope you'll be able to get some ideas from the way we do things at Creative Assembly. My particular subject today for you is balancing out historical accuracy versus player agency. It's a very particular design subject when we design historical games, how to make sure we stay true to history and in the same time cater to our players and give them a game to play. The past, as you realize, history is a straight line of events, for the most part. It should be, it's supposed to be. While gameplay is a series of forking, branching choices. So there's a clear opposition there, you know, history just as being a straight line, and game design, gameplay being a series of challenges. So how much should player be able to influence the past, change the past, stay a while, find out, if you're interested. So that's me. My name is Victor Dosev. I'm senior game designer and project lead for Creative Assembly. I've been doing game design professionally for 13 years. My work includes Thrones of Britannia, Rome 2, before that Arena of Fate, which is a mobile game, Earthrise, which was a MMORPG game. So right now, with Creative Assembly, we're working on the Total War franchise as a whole. I personally find making games more interesting than actually playing them. I'll say why. Because when you play a game, you get to experience a particular subset, a particular slice of the whole experience, right? On any particular playthrough, you only get to see just your particular set of choices, that is the outcomes from the choices you've made. When you design a game, you get to experience all of them together in the same time. Just everything, the whole experience is there. So when I design games, I actually get to play all the game that there is. So that's it for me. I think game design is the best job in the world, so that's why I do that. Okay. Why make or play historical games? Just to give you some tips, might give you an idea why it would be beneficial to you to venture into historical games. But first, let's start with the definition, what makes a game historical. It's surprising to me there isn't a clear definition. Even with literature, with other forms of media, it's still unclear how much historical accuracy do you need to have to be considered historical. With literature, there's a clear divide between just fiction, be it fantasy, speculative fiction, alternative history, science fiction, and actual historical fiction that people would consider historical. The same is with games. There are games that only feature a nod to history, you know, just some vague pop culture stereotype of a reference to history. Hollywood tends to do that a lot. They need to present history to the mainstream public, and they change it a bit and often fall into stereotypes. It's something you should be really aware of not portraying particular subjects in a way that may be, how should I say, not proper to the actual people or subject matter. So, let's say you want to make a historical game, or you're thinking about it. What's your biggest benefit in making a historical game? You see that screen? Who's that character, do you think, on the left? On the horse? The main character? Any guess? That's right, exactly. Julius Caesar. That's your immediate benefit right there. Immediate recognition. Whenever you delve into historical games, that's your main benefit. You have your audience already established for you. People know and people like history. You don't need to get your point across. You don't need to sell them your particular fantasy. You don't need to convince them it's cool. People know history. People like history. So that's your biggest benefit. It's like having an IP that is actually free, you know, because historical events are public domain. There's plenty of research available everywhere. So you could just build on top of that. When you make your own game, your own IP, you need to do all the research, all the exploration, and then you need to convince other people to like it, what's cool about it. With historical games, that's already there for you. What other benefits are there, besides the immediate recognition in the existing user base? Research is available. When I say it's free, it's not actually free. We spend a lot of money on books. It's still a very insignificant sum compared to licensing an IP, recognizable IP. I wouldn't say like Star Wars or anything from that caliber, but still you need to pay licensing fees. With books, they could get quite expensive when you actually need to research something that was not well known, and there is just some very old actual physical book existing in some second-hand market somewhere. They can go all the way up to $500. That's still pretty cheap, right? And not like a licensing deal. So even if sometimes you have to do your own research, us as a relatively large company, we have the funds, we have the abilities, we have the resources to actually do science work in the field. Players really like that. I mean, we are benefiting the society as a whole this way. It's not just the game. We are actually pushing the boundaries of what we know about history. We're doing our own research. We're doing our own exploration of subjects. And historical fans really dig it. It's one thing to just tell them something they've read, in books. It's another thing to actually give them something new. Many players, many people have actual knowledge of history, proper expertise, maybe historical background, maybe a university program or something, and they know what's out there. But when you go out and actually do your own thing about a subject, and it really expands their knowledge base, and they're really grateful for that, because history usually gets we don't do nearly as enough research on history as we should. Another benefit would be if your team is already a fan of historical games, like ours is. Turns out us in Sofia were a really good fit for Creative Assembly as a whole. There were many existing players among my developers who actually like historical games, so that was a huge plus for us. But what about you? What if you are not already filled with talented people who are also historical experts? You would need to make the proper acquisitions. It's really hard to have, say, top designer, top programmer, top artist who is also a historical expert, right? It's just a really tight coincidence if it happens to be so. So if it's not like that for you, you will need to, new people that you hire will need to have that background to fill in the gaps that you need. It's really interesting how many people actually have expertise on history. You'd be surprised. Just a tip there. When we hire QAs, for example, it turns out a lot of them actually do possess some historical background, some actual proper education. So we just win from that situations when we have people like that on board to consult us. Because the other specialists that are much more, how should I say, less harder to find out, programmers, artists, especially the higher ups, you can't rely on them being historical fans. You need to somehow fill the gap. Another benefit to historical games is that they actually do sell well. Players play them. I'm sorry I can't show you the exact statistics at the moment. It's just something I had outside of the presentations. But if you research online, you could see the numbers. They do sell well. So it's important to know why they sell so well, who are the people who buy them, why do they buy them, how you can satisfy them, what they are looking for in a historical game. This particular screen shows the Quantic Foundry's model of player motivation. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's an excellent design and marketing tool. It's available online. It's free. Quantic Foundry does market research on player motivation. It's really up to date. I personally believe it's the most, how should I say, relevant at the moment game industry resource for that. Some of you probably are familiar with definitions like socializers, achievers, skewers. This is the old Bartos definition, the old Bartos taxonomy of player types, but it's slightly outdated. It's still true, but it was mostly intended for MMORPGs. You should understand that. I still hear talk about the game industry every now and then. The subject pops up, and we do comment on people like saying this is a socializing type of activity or achieving type of activity. It's a great foundation, but it's a bit particular to the MMORPG genre. So this model, the Quantic Foundry's model, is more holistic. It tries to cater to all game genres and help you identify what players like, what players find fun in games. Just a really conclusive theory about it. So they break down player motivation to several categories. And one thing historical games all have in common is fantasy. Fantasy not in the sense of swords and dragons and magic, but more like just the psychological thing of immersing yourself. Once upon a time, here's the definition, being somewhere else, someone else, somewhere else. So that's what all historical games have in common, regardless of the gameplay genre they might fall into. For example, I could easily identify myself in our games on this list. What other player motivations are there for us in the Total War franchise? We don't have much of the social aspect. We're not that prominent multiplayer-wise. Action, we have real-time combat, so yeah, we do have some action in it, but for the most part, it's still a turn-based strategy game, the strategic part. Creativity, the ability to express yourself, do funny things in the game. We are sandbox games, so we do have some of that as well. You might just build churches everywhere you go, so that's your way of expressing it. You can do that in our game. Mastery, certainly. Many games feature mastery by default, some more than others. If you have a competitive scene, you'd probably be really particular about your mastery aspect of your game. So try to check your games against this particular model, and you'll be surprised what things pop up. There are various lectures on the findings of their study of Quantic Foundries, and there are certain relations between demographics and what people like, what particular genres are, say, females attracted to, males attracted to. You'd be surprised. I mean, our intuition is not correct most of the time about these things. Just see the numbers and make your own conclusions about your own games. This doesn't concern historical games in particular or strategy games. Every game can benefit from some structured approach about player motivation and your intended target audience. Let's move forward. So yeah, fantasy and immersion is an important thing to achieve in historical games. It ties up with historicity. What is historicity? You could read the definition itself. It's in Wikipedia. It's nothing fancy. It's just the historical actuality of person and events, meaning the quality of being part of history, as opposed to being a historical myth, legend or fiction. Historicity focuses on the true value of knowledge, claims about the past, denoting historical actuality, authenticity, and factuality. What it means is that a historical game needs to have certain amount of historicity in it. If it has too much historicity, or full historicity even, it would not be a game. It would just be a documentary, right? If you're 100% true to the facts, it's just what it was. There is no fiction in it. If you have too little historicity in your historical game, you would not be considered historical game, you would be considered some sort of fiction in the sense of literature genres. Say, you'd be fantasy or sci-fi or alternate history or some other form of speculative fiction. You need to strike a balance between the two. So, historicity does contribute to immersion, right? The more accurately you portray the surroundings of the player, the more he gets sucked into the fantasy. So historicity helps establish this simulation aspect of the game, of how things are and how things were. There's also a threefold model. It was well known a little while ago in the industry, and also the GDS theory which sprang out of it. It says, any resolution of in-game events can satisfy the goals of either drama, simulation, or game. By advancing towards one of the goals, one is moving away from the others. Let's just keep drama away from the equation for now. It's important, you should know about it, but it's not what I like to focus in this particular subject. I'd like to make you pay attention to simulation and game. Simulation is just what we just talked about, historicity, being true to the facts, to the factuality of what happened, and game is just a synonym for gameplay in this particular regard. So the point here is that those two things are inherently at odds. Both are good things by themselves. Having a strong gameplay is a great thing. Having great simulation is also a good thing, but simulation is more appropriate for, say, non-interactive media like literature and cinema and stuff like that. For games, you need to have gameplay. And those two things will often be at odds with one another when you try to design a historical game. When you are in doubt whether you should focus on gameplay or historicity, or simulation in this particular case, go with game every time, 100%. Game is more important if you are in doubt. Of course, there are limits to it, but my recommendation is to go game. If you don't go with game, why are doing games? Do cinema, do other forms of entertainment. It's totally great, don't get me wrong. It's just games need to have gameplay. There's no other way around it. That's my definition for games. We could ponder the subject of whether interactive experiences fall into the game category or not. It's not important for this talk. But either way, if you're considering these two subjects, always favor gameplay. So, simulation versus game. What other challenges it poses before you as a designer or even as an artist? Historicity is just a synonym to simulation in this particular case, but let's look about realism versus variety. In historical games, you often have the problem that history doesn't give you enough to make good gameplay, good, varied, interesting, challenging gameplay. You can't have, for example, distinct enough factions warring against one another, because actually they didn't have that many weapon varieties among them in that period. So they end up looking the same, and that's not good for gameplay, right? For good gameplay, it's nice to have variety, it's nice to have asymmetrical gameplay, to have different pros and cons to the different factions, but in reality, those factions were usually pretty close to one another. Say, for example, your gameplay dictates that you should have, it would be really great for the gameplay, the way the battle works for you, per se, to have a flying ranged unit. Tough luck. 8th century Vikings didn't have flying long-range units, and you have problem with actually filling that gap in your gameplay when you say, okay, I have these axe-wielding, murder-loving Vikings, they're solid damage dealers, solid front lines, bulky, but they don't have any range support. It would have been great if they had one. You don't have one, sorry. History doesn't give you that. So it's hard to balance realism versus variety very often. The same goes for, say, weapon types. For the most part of history, spear was the only actual widespread weapon. More interesting weapons like axes or even swords were way later in history, like high medieval stuff. Almost no one had access to swords for the majority. Spear was always a hunting tool, it was always available. But when you make a game, it's really hard to justify having just one weapon type regardless of genre, be it Assassin's Creed, be it adventure game, be it action adventure game, be it strategy game. You just don't have enough. So what do you do in that case? What do you do when history doesn't give you enough variety in the area that you need? You find where the variety actually came from in that historical context. What made one unit better than the other, one person better than the other, one army better than the other? See what actually differentiated those armies back then. Was it morale thing? Was it something psychological, like being superstitious about things, being fearful? Or was it, say, a matter of discipline? What was actually that give people the advantage back then, and stress on that. Take it to the front, make the gameplay about that. Us as designers, we often have our own gameplay, how should I say, models that we like to apply in the game, but with historical games you need to be aware that you need to portray the subject matter even more so than with other IPs or other fields. You just need to, a player will call you out if you feel something that is strikingly out of context and out of place. Your job is to capture the essence of the historical period, of what was interesting about it, of what made some of the actors there the losers and some the victors, and you need to portray that and include it as a game mechanic. If weapon types is great for, I don't know, a modern game or a fantasy game, having different weapon types, it wasn't so for the historical period. Find out what was good for the historical period. Factuality versus control over outcomes. That's a given. History had very clear outcomes that we know of. We could argue about the accuracy of some of our evidence on the matter, but still there are theories that are widely accepted as facts. In a game, though, you would like to give players control over outcomes. If players cannot influence the outcome of a battle, it wouldn't be very fun for them, for the most part. Say the landing in Normandy, say the battle with Waterloo, you would probably like maybe the English people to win against the French. But that's how you break historical accuracy. It might be a good thing, just be aware of it, that those things are at odds. Having factuality from history and giving your players control over their own actions, agency, all that jazz. So it all boils down to how things were versus how things the player wants them to be, and how do you strike the balance between the two. How much freedom you give the player, and how much do you need to stay true to still be considered historical in that sense. So it's either reliving the past or changing it. And for the most part, people like to change the past. No one just wants to be there and just experience things they were. Even if you're, say, you like in particular Caesar, or you admire Attila, or some other important character from history, you don't want to be him like 100%, right? You want to be in his shoes. You want to be facing the same challenges. You want to be put in the same situation as him, but you don't need to repeat his steps verbatim. It's just not fun. It's just factuality. It's just a documentary. It's not playing. I'll show you some ways to break historical accuracy later in favor of gameplay, but let's see how we can achieve historical gameplay. The most important takeaway is that you cannot have 100% historical accuracy in a game. You just cannot. By definition, from what we've seen so far, those things are taught. You need to make compromises. So one way to think about it in a structured way is to focus on one area being historically accurate and give players the ability to change the other areas. Say being accurate about your place, the territory you're making the game about, the time, the period, or the event of a particular historical subject, or a character. You just really like to portray a very famous particular historical character. Focus on that. Let's see how we've done that in Total War. Thrones of Britannia, the title gives it away, right? Thrones of Britannia. You are very well aware what to expect from that game. You would be able to fight somewhere around those isles. The time and even the characters are secondary to it, right? But the place is what's important. No matter what you do in the game, you would always be on the British Isles. The game may well span beyond what was the actual historical period, which was in this particular case 8th and 9th century, which was the Viking raids on the British Isles. But in the game, in our game in particular, the action could take place way beyond that if the player wishes so. There is nothing in the game that stops the game when the period ends, say, halfway into the 10th century or something like that. In game, you could reach 300 years, while the period itself covered 200. That's okay. And also, your characters. Maybe when you start a game with Thrones of Britannia, you have some historically accurate characters that were there and we know of them. But what if they die? What if you kill them? It's okay. It's not important in this particular game to stay true to a particular character. It's more important the place. The other things could be influenced by gameplay, but the historical accuracy comes from the place. Time. This is Empire Divided. It's about the 3rd century crisis in Rome. The empire was besieged on all fronts. There was famine, there was plagues, there were bandits all over. The empire was really decentralized at the time. Christianity was on the rise, cults were on the rise, so the empire was besieged from all fronts. What does that say? It says the period has a certain flavor to it. No matter what you do with gameplay, you need to capture that flavor of the period. The characters are not important. Many of you probably know who Queen Zenobia is, right? Many of you probably have heard of Emperor Aurelian, but still, for this particular game, we chose that the period itself is more important, and characters might vary or be influenced by character decisions, and the same goes for territory. Maybe if you play with Aurelian, you would go into a different place, not where Aurelian initially went, so place is not as important, but the period is important. And for characters, Attila is a very charismatic, particular character who is well known, so we decided to just stay true to him. In this particular game, the historical accuracy comes from the character. No matter what you do as a player, you will always be or face Attila. He will always be there. He's the focus. Gameplay can influence other parts of the game. Where the game takes place, you might venture into different territories that were actually conquered by Attila, or in different time, but no matter what, you will always end up facing Attila. That's how we achieve historical accuracy with that particular game. I'll need to speed things up a bit. Here are ways to break historical accuracy. Just to touch upon this briefly, I'd like to say this is my particular take on them. There are people here with more expertise to talk about these subjects than me, but hear me out. Alternate history. What would have happened if the Axis powers won World War II? It's hard to say it's actually historical games, but it certainly has historical elements to it. It certainly gives that mood away from being historical. That's what happens when you change a very particular event. What if things happen differently? This is the ultimate what if fantasy. But it's not really a historical game. In this particular example, the choice already happened before gameplay even began. We already departed from history, right? We already know it's not accurate. Assassin's Creed, very good example of secret history. It's about what we don't know happened in those particular historical periods. We explore the gaps, the gaps in history, our gaps are in our knowledge. Things may or may not have happened this way, but we don't have a concrete, specific evidence that it didn't happen this way, right? So we can show some interesting stuff. Of course, the main characters are not historical. The plot itself is not historically accurate, but there are some very historical elements, very accurate elements in Assassin's Creed. For example, the cities are well celebrated as being very, very detailed, very good windows into the everyday life of the period of that particular time and place. People really like and enjoy how much detail has been put into showcasing those cities. Warped world, what I mean by that? I mean inconsistency in historical accuracy in terms of the physical space, of spatial accuracy. In Age of Empires, certainly ranges are off, right? Many RTS games do that. Empires were not 1 kilometer away from one another, and many of the maps are randomly generated or not properly accurate. Although the cultures themselves existed, the kingdoms themselves were probably like the way they were portrayed in the game, but they certainly didn't face off that often the way they do in the game. So the physical aspect of the game is shifted, so gameplay wins over it. Civilization does something similar, but with time, with a temporal component of historical accuracy. While Age of Empires shifts mostly the physical space, Civilization warps time. So you could have one civilization being in Bronze Age, one being with contemporary tanks. That's a fun thing to explore. That's one way to break historical accuracy in favor of gameplay. This is just some examples of how you could break historical accuracy to achieve greater gameplay. So where to draw the line between the real, what we considered real historical Egypt and a gameplay representation? It's hard to say. It's up to you. You should be aware of the consequences. You should be mindful of certain things. It all comes down to you eventually. Just a brief list of tips for you to consider when striking that balance. Consider your gameplay genre. Some gameplay genres go better with certain forms of historical accuracy than others. Be it a rally with chariots maybe, or a game about hunting. A game about hunting certainly can be in almost any period. A game about competing chariots needs to be in Rome, pretty much, maybe Greece, to be historically accurate. Consider your audience. If you have an existing audience, or if you are targeting a particular audience, find more about them. What do they like? How much historical accuracy would be important for them? Strengthen the team. Be consistent. It's really important, once you commit to a certain level of historical accuracy, stick to it, and in that particular area, always have that level of historical accuracy. it's okay to be to be more or less historically accurate, so long as it's the same level of inaccuracy, so to speak. So players know how to perceive your game. It's all right for players to change, to have their minds changed, but it costs them energy, and they don't like being forced to it very often. In the beginning of the game, you say, that is our historical accuracy, these are our boundaries, do you like it? Some players will say yes, they will stick with it, it's fine. But if you keep challenging their expectations, it will tire them down, and it will feel inconsistent to them. So in the end, it will be just a mess in their head. You will not have a clear message, a good fantasy to sell. Advertise correctly. If your game is more or less historical, make sure the players know. Don't have nasty surprises for them when they expect a hard historical facts and they get some loosey interpretation of stereotypes. And be responsible. Some subjects are sensitive to a lot of people, turns out. Our stance in Creative Assembly is to be simulating and not judging. These things happened for as far as we know, as far as it's widely accepted, but you still need to be mindful. For example, we've always wanted to make a game about the rise of Islam. It's a very significant portion of history about it. We're still trying to find good ways to portray the different actors in that particular scenario so everyone gets the best of it. There are certainly the topics of slavery, subjugation in certain periods, and people could be sensitive about it. Also, us, the Westerners, are really easy prey to falling for stereotypes when we portray other civilizations, other parts of the world. Don't do that. People there don't like it. Of course, they have the right to it. So be mindful and be respectful. Also, just to recap things, this is how we do things in Creative Assembly, how we achieve our historical accuracy. We set the stage. In the beginning of the game, everything is historically accurate, or at least we would like to. Some specific cases we cannot be 100%, but if we could, we would be. We would be 100% verbatim snapshot of that particular year, day, and scenario that was in that particular era that we know of. Say Rome, we want to strike the borders right, we want to have the right characters, we want everything to be as people know it in the beginning. Then we give players full control. Our game is a sandbox strategy, so you could, from that point on, you could kill characters, you could expand your borders, you could conquer the world, you could be everywhere, anywhere around the globe, which is most of the time not historically accurate, but we give you that fantasy, right? This is what our games is about. Achieving more than a particular state or kingdom actually achieved in life. It's a very compelling fantasy for many people. Say Armenia to conquer the world. It didn't happen, but it's possible in our game. That's 100% historically inaccurate, but what gives? It's a sandbox game. We give you full control as players to do that. And at the end of it, we still need to stay in team. So no matter what happens in the game, the outcome still needs to fit the period or the historical accuracy that you're aiming for. All games are eventually about selling a fantasy. All games that are not heavily abstracted, that is. Certainly all historical games as we've seen before, are about fantasy. Just the idea that you're someone else, somewhere else, that you're trying to let the player perceive themselves of being in a different situations, having to deal with certain things they cannot do in life. So all games are about selling a fantasy. Don't break it for them. You've sold them the fantasy already, don't break it for them. It might be all right for the Roman Empire to focus heavily on technology and achieve certain technology faster that happened in real life, say double crop rotation or something like that. But it wouldn't be appropriate for them to suddenly discover orbital bombardment and satellites and something like that. You might say, gameplay-wise, it should almost be possible, right? If you stuck everything into technology, eventually, shouldn't you be able to do that? Maybe. But to stay true to the subject and to the theme, you need to stay true to to put the boundaries somewhere, something being appropriate there. So that's it. That's it from me. Thank you.